Okay. So we're going to be talking about this next generation of models, semi-structural models that we're going to be using for doing the not the teal books for the US. And should become obvious why we're using semi-structural models, given the recent experiences of using people trying to use DSG models. Obviously, they have transmission mechanisms that are way too powerful, expectational channels that are way too powerful for thinking about using for production and so on. So we're going back to never left what we refer to as semi-structural quarterly projection models. And so we've been using these extensively over the years. These models make explicit they're consistent with Bernanke's recommendations on modeling and how to think about modeling. It makes expectational dynamics very explicit. And in fact, Mervyn King has recently in a Riksbank conference said that we need models with endogenous monetary policy credibility. Well, guess what? We've had them for 30 years. They were a very integral part of the development of state-of-the-art monetary policy frameworks, first generation of FPAS frameworks, and so on. And so what we're doing now is, and this is work with asyakostanyan, is we've gone back to our quarterly projection models and asked, can we construct a monthly projection model that has basically the same dynamics as what our quarterly projection models have? And so this model that we're going to be looking at today satisfies that criteria, that it has, everything a quarterly projection model would have in terms of dynamics, but it's done at a monthly frequency. And that allows us to get at another Bernanke recommendation, which is to start training economists that not only know how to build models, but know how to use them, that have some sense about what is happening in the real world and follows what we describe as heat principles when we do economic analysis and so on. So by heat, we mean have an historical narrative that, where economists actually know something about the country experience and so on. E uses economics in a very pragmatic way. So we like to say, I'd rather have Bob Solo than an econometric model, but I'd rather have Bob Solo with an econometric model than without one. What we mean by that is that we can't build the models without having economists that understand the historical narrative. And once they do that, they then think about what are the objectives of the model. And of course, they then make a lot of pragmatic decisions as opposed to thinking that there's some true model out there that we simply have to find the answer to. That approach has been a complete and utter failure, as we will explain during our paper, The Future of Macro. So this paper that we're working on this week is to try to come up with a nice little example of how we think about modeling and teaching economists or young people how to be economists. So we picked a topic that we think is kind of neat because it will involve extending the basic model of endogenous monetary policy credibility that we have, where we focused on the risks of temporizing with stagflationary shocks and allowing long-term inflation expectations to ratchet up. And then, of course, you have to generate then high interest rates and big recessions to not only bring inflation back to the target, but to re-anchor. But in addition to that, we'll now, in this case, also consider the costs of getting stuck in a low inflation trap like the euro area was stuck in before COVID. And so the euro area was unsuccessful at getting inflation durably up to the 2% target. And when one looks at long-term inflation expectations, I'm going to show you a little chart here. So the actual title that we're working with on this paper is called International Policy Coordination and Risk Adjusted UIP. But a very important part of that mathematics of understanding the costs and the risks of allowing long-term inflation expectations to ratchet downwards is that you can result in um, asset prices like real 10-year bond rates and the exchange rate. They can start acting as uh, shock amplifiers in the system and can actually reinforce a low inflation trap, or they can also, if when you have good monetary policy frameworks backed up suitably with fiscal policy, how that can avoid those low inflation traps and so on. And so we go through a bunch of data on Japan, comparing Japan to Canada during the GFC, and show how the lack of a framework in Japan resulted in fairly substantial costs, in the sense that not having that framework meant that they had no or very little interest rate space when they got hit by the global financial crisis. And this resulted in the appreciation in the yen and a massive contraction in exports. And of course, the higher real interest rates meant that domestic demand was much lower. Whereas in a seasoned, fairly credible framework, Canada, we can see that the Canadian dollar depreciated and provided somewhat of a shock absorbing role. They had interest rate space, in this case, around 400 basis points, because they weren't stuck in a low inflation trap like Japan was. And as a result, when bad things happen, they could loosen monetary conditions and help deal with the shock. Well, in Japan, unfortunately, this correlation between the exchange rate and things that drive the stock market have the wrong sign, in the sense that on days when there's bad economic news where you expect the stock market to fall, the exchange rate appreciates, and that's not a good thing. In credible frameworks where policies are expected to adjust the expected path of the policy rate sufficiently aggressively, you would have more of a shock absorbing. Now we look and apply the same logic of that to the early stages of COVID. And so if we just think back to February, March, after the joint World Health Organization China mission got back from China, and they reported to the world what China was doing to deal with COVID, everybody went into a panic, knowing that they would not be able to impose those kinds of uh, measures, as forcefully as China, which meant that the world was going to get infected with COVID. And of course, not having a vaccine, uncertainty went way up. There was a wonderful presentation. Everybody needs to look at it, by Stephen Davis on the Better Policy Project YouTube channel. It was the very first or the second video that we did in YouTube that goes through some very nice research going back to Robert Barrow's model of rare and catastrophic events. And so that's a good model for helping to think through something like a COVID shock where uncertainty goes way up. Obviously, there's an increase in precautionary saving. People flock to risk-free assets and so on. But in that world, equity prices obviously should decline, which is what they did, by about 35%. Global equity markets contracted over a 4-week period by 35%. If you go back to Steve James's paper and presentation on the Better Policy Project YouTube channel. So 10% the first week, another 10 the second, another 10 the third, and then finally, I think there was an additional 5% in the fourth week, and so on. So now what we would argue is that aggregate demand fell by more than aggregate supply. So this paper has to explain how you would create estimates of the output gap and potential output and the natural rate of unemployment during a period like COVID. Again, how would Bob Solow have created a measure of the output gap and unemployment, being a pragmatist and understanding the basic economics of what happened. So early phase lockdowns. Okay, so clearly aggregate supply fell. There's no denying that, even though it's not incorporated in the estimates of the Congressional Budget Office, nor does the Fed have actually any estimates, real-time estimates of potential output and so on. The Reserve Bank of New Zealand and the Bank of Canada do. So we have another project underway, basically showing how these people adjust potential output in those central banks, where they have a pretty long history of using measures of potential output and the natural rate to not only think about monetary policy, but also to communicate it and so on. So the basic story is this: aggregate demand fell by more than aggregate supply because of the increase in precautionary saving. Obviously, if businesses are facing so much uncertainty that they think that they might not be able to even be open or be able to sell their product in the future, that's not going to be the time for investing. And then lastly, because the consumption bundle was constrained, in other words, people could not consume all the goods and services that they wanted to consume. The question is, what happens? How do you think about demand and supply in response to that? And the argument is that that could be an argument for why demand could be falling by more than supply. So if you shut down some sectors, obviously supply falls in those sectors, but the question is, what happens to aggregate demand? And the argument is that if there is high intertemporal elasticities of substitution between those types of things, so think of international vacations and so on, and think of substituting an international vacation to being able to go somewhere domestically. So if that elasticity of substitution, in terms of substitution from one place to another place inside my country, is small relative to the intertemporal elasticity of substitution, meaning effectively I'll save the money that I would have spent on my international vacation and wait until the economy opens up and then spend it later. And the evidence strongly suggests that that's the way that worked in practice. So the idea is that aggregate demand fell by more than aggregate supply. That's consistent with all the inflationary indicators, whether or not you don't just look at headline inflation, but you look at non-traded sticky price inflation, or you look at service price inflation, you look at core PCE, you look at wages, you can see that they all fell. Okay, that corroborates this kind of story that aggregate demand and aggregate supply, they both fell in the initial phases of COVID, and that resulted in downward. But we have to realize the context, and the context was that in the United States, so these are data on long-term inflation expectations, or specifically what are inflation expectations expected to be over the next 10 years. Over the next 10 years, that's important to understand the concept we're dealing with. And you can see before COVID, in 2018, they were almost bang on the 2.3%. It's 2.3% because it's CPI and not the PCE, so it's CPI indexed bonds. But they were starting to drift down. Actually, the Fed was concerned about that, and that's one of the reasons why policy was, why they factored in allowing inflation to overshoot and so on, because they were concerned about it undershooting for many, many years. And they didn't want to become like Europe. Europe is the black line, or the euro area specifically. And you can see there that long-term inflation expectations, had gotten up to just a bit more than 1.5%, or significantly below the target. And the longer and longer that happened, and they allowed it to happen, that gap got bigger and bigger and bigger. And when COVID happened, in other words, these disinflationary shocks happened that widened this gap. Put another way, financial markets anticipated that the Fed, and in fact, the US authorities, were going to do whatever it took to not get stuck in this low inflation trap. So you can see the green line, gradually converges back to, the 2.3% range. Whereas in the euro area, long-term inflation expectations continue to go down. This is just looking at it in terms of real interest rates. All this is saying is that when you look at that green line, that real interest rates were low enough in the United States to be consistent with people expecting that inflation would converge back to the 2% target. Whereas even though real interest rates were lower in the euro area, they weren't low enough, obviously, to prevent the market thinking that the low inflation trap was just going to get bigger and bigger. So we want to have a model that has endogenous monetary policy credibility on both the low side and the high side. And so I'm going to be taking you through this model. I'm currently running Dynair MATLAB, but we will have one in Dynair Octave, and all this stuff that we're doing here also runs in Dynair Julia, actually even much faster. So this is some code going back to April of 2024 when we first designed this model. So Hikas and I are working on it. One of the great things about the model, thanks to Dynair Julia, is that the coding of the expectation theory of the term structure is so much easier now. When we're thinking about coding the 10-year bond rate, and we have like a monthly projection model, that's like going to be a moving average of something that contains 120 months into the future, because the expectation theory of the term structure says that a 10-year bond rate, okay, or in this case, that would be a 120-month bond, okay, it would be equal to the expected path of the policy rate over the next 120 months, okay, then plus a term premium. And so writing out equations that long are a bit of a pain. Maybe that's one reason why people have ignored the expectation theory of the term structure and work with such very simplistic models that assume that there's a one period bond. So if you look at in any DSG model, 99.9% of them would just have a one bond that is internationally traded and rolls over. And of course, that's very implausible. When we think about the transmission mechanism in the real world, we need to think of different maturities on bonds, and of course, then there being risk premium that go from those government bond deals to the rates that households and businesses face and so on. But now we can do this by just using a little dynamic macro that allows us to define strings. In this case, the model includes interest rates up to 5-year bonds, which are 60-month bonds. But we also want to keep track of 2-year bonds or 24-month bonds or 1-year bonds, which are 12-month bonds, as well as 3-month and 6 months. So this allows us to write much more beautiful code and so on. So again, this is a model of the US and the Euro area. The nice thing is that we can also include documentation when we're defining the variables so we can prepare a nice report. So the model's going to have, take you through, forget about the variables now and scoot down to the equations, which is a much nicer way for introducing the model. And so, as I said, we're going to follow the Bernanke recommendation. We've been following it for the last 30 years. So why stop now? And what that means is that when we specify our Phillips curve, we're going to be very exact in the sense that we're going to model inflation expectations, and we're going to tell you what that model is, and so we can keep track of it. And that's not just because we think that we know a lot about it. It's partly because of our ignorance, because we don't know very much about it, that we want to be able to keep track of it. And so our standard Phillips curve is going to have this lambda 1 times expectations of inflation plus 1 minus lambda times the lag. And it's a semi-structural model, so we've got a lot of freedom here in terms of we specify that. We're going to be using the year-on-year rate, again, because it's monthly data. It's going to be like pi 12, or the year-on-year rate over the last 12 months and so on. And pi is going to be the monthly annualized. And we're all working in logs here. So this would be the log of the price index minus the log of the price index lagged times 1200. Okay, so we multiply it by 12 to annualize it, and then multiply by 100 so that it's approximately percent and so on. And then the next equation is, or the next term in the equation, 247, is just our convex Phillips curve. Again, ECB conference, very first thing on the agenda was the convex Phillips curve. Again, another recommendation where people seem to be catching up to where we were 30 years ago, trying to incorporate convexity in the model, because with that convexity, along with the endogenous monetary policy credibility, we're going to be able to make some very interesting insights and calculations and so on. So we have this output gap in the equation. It's entering with a moving average, and again, that's because we're trying to replicate the kinds of quarterly dynamics that we had in our quarterly models, showing that we're not losing anything, only gaining things. The equation also has the real exchange rate in it. So you can see in the European equation that we have the real exchange rate entering the inflation equation, but in differences and so on. Let me take that back. So it's entering right now in levels. And so we're going to need to have another option where it also enters in differences. And so the version that we have right now with this lambda 3, okay, so we're going to add another term there, lambda 4, where it can also enter in differences. And so there's going to be two views of how the real exchange rate can affect inflation. One view is that it's an intermediate input that is imported into the country and then used as a factor of production. And so that's that interpretation. Another interpretation is that there are some goods that are imported that are close to final, and there's only maybe some distribution value that is added to it. And in that case, the change form is going to be more appropriate, because you just want to think about it as bundling the two types of goods. But in this aggregate model, you just don't want to keep track of that, and as a result, we would just think of that as being the change in the real exchange rate, as opposed to keeping track of two types of goods and so on. That's the benefit of semi-structural models, is that we can do these little tricks to capture the dynamics of what would be in a theoretically consistent model in many cases. Okay, then just a definition of the real short-term interest rate. Then we need to have stochastic processes for the equilibrium real interest rate. So for both countries, we have just assumptions that they're first order serially correlated processes. Just a definition of the real interest rate gap. Then we have a definition of the year-on-year inflation rate, which of course is just the difference in the price level from today and from 12 periods ago. Or we can just accumulate up the changes, the month-on-month changes over the last year, which is the way the equation is writing out the difference in the price level over the last year, just a moving average of the past. Then we have our model of credibility, okay, where we think of credibility being a stock. Okay, so credibility depends on its lag, but it also has a shock. So things can shock the level of credibility down, for example. And it also depends on a signal, or basically indicator of central bank performance. Okay, so in this case, the central bank performance is going to be computed by asking, is inflation converging back to the 2% target over a 1 to 2 year horizon? Okay, so what does that mean? Okay, it means that okay, line 277, for example, we ask, if we were to observe the year-on-year inflation rate today, okay, so that would be this number right here. And if we would have done a forecast last period with a little univariate model that suggested that the person believes that inflation will converge to the target over a period of 1 to 2 years, in other words, with a serial correlation coefficient of about 0.5, okay, what would the error be? So if you observed inflation today, okay, in period T, okay, what would the forecast error have been? Okay, which is what we're trying to compute. If you would have observed inflation today, and you would have had this forecasting equation for predicting today. In other words, on a gradual path that's returning back to the target. And so same thing for the high inflation state. Okay, we can look, has inflation, how has it behaved relative to a forecasting equation that basically allows inflation to kind of gradually drift up. Okay, in other words, an inflation process that has lots of persistence in it. And so obviously by calculating those two forecast errors, we can then construct a signal that is basically a weighted, sum of the squared value of the high regime. Okay. So if the forecast area of the high regime is 0, okay, then this signal is going to be, this forecast error is going to be really, really high. Okay. And so we want that signal to factor into this measure of credibility. Okay. Um, in a very gradual way. Okay, so how can the central bank develop credibility? Get lucky. hope for pray, Lucasi, for great moderation shocks. Okay, uh, uh, certainly you don't want to get stagflationary shocks because that's going to make your job much 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 more difficult to bring inflation back. Okay, so what do we need to do, Lucasi? This is your assignment. Actually, I think only Anahid uh, has the computer working right now. Okay, so I guess it's her assignment to get this done. But what I want you to do is I want you to extend the model so that it includes both a high inflation regime and a low inflation regime. Okay, now that means that you'll have to decide on certain things like, for example, in the high inflation regime, we have a calculation. Let's see, high inflation regime US. So this parameter right here. Um, so we need to go and find out what that parameter is. Hmm, Did I get it wrong? Nope, nope, nope. High inflation regime US. Okay, so 10%. Okay, so what do you think, guys? If you're going to do the low inflation regime, what do you think the value should be for the low inflation parameter? It's 10% here. What should it be for
2%,
the
right?
low one? Lacassie, what do you
2 or
think it should be?
2.5%.
No, that's what the credible monetary policy
Mhm.
regime. Now we're trying to put a low inflation trap into it. Okay. So this would be a number below the target. What would it be? So above the target we use 10, but what would it be below the target?
Like above zero, and maybe 0.8 or 0.
Why?
Because when inflation, we need positive inflation because it's crucial for our economy working well.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's not the only reason. Okay, that's not the only reason. Okay, so we want to appeal to something that was about data. Okay, so
okay.
now for 10, it's really easy because it's double digits. Okay, and it's kind of what the advanced economies experience during bad times. Okay, but on the basis of the empirical evidence, what do we have about deflation or low inflation traps? How low have they gotten?
Could you
Do you
repeat
have
what
any
was the
idea?
coefficient for? So you said the coefficient for low inflation regime, right? And it was what?
So, so what I was trying to do is to guys get you to think about Japan. Okay, like what countries have we had really low inflation traps? Okay, so Japan. Okay, but it's not symmetric, obviously, because we don't observe like minus 10% deflation. We don't observe we minus hyperinflation. Okay, so we have to come up with a plausible magnitude. And so what I would suggest is -1 or -2. Okay. But that is totally your call because it matters less about what that is than what it actually does in the model. Okay, so to answer that question, there's no objective answer. It's all it's an unobservable variable, and it matters to nobody on this planet aside from the people that are listening to your entire story about how the entire model economy works and what insights that model economy has. But what I would do is maybe try -1 or -2. Okay, Anahit. Okay. Now,
Okay.
now
But
that's
can I ask
there's some other equations here. Carry on. Yes.
but -1 and -2 will not cause a financial disruption in the economy?
Will not cause what?
Financial instability.
Potentially, yes. That's the whole idea. Potentially, yes, because so what we're going to be doing is studying situations where the central bank is always dominant at bringing inflation back to the target, where these two alternative regimes are are potentially pulling us away, okay, or making it difficult to get back, okay. But in the discussion for the Oxford paper, the reason why David Vines is interested, why guys like Larry Summers finds our work interesting, is we can study that problem in a way where we don't go all the way to multiple equilibria. But yeah, of course, the thing is potentially unstable, and of course, we'll need to we need to understand that when we're interpreting the results. And for example, sometimes the model won't converge under certain types of shocks, and that's theoretically possible. Okay, so that's part of the big boy world of dealing with nonlinear models and their problems and so on. But the advantage here is that we have extremely powerful algorithms in Dynair. We're going to be solving this mixed complementarity problem, and it has all the divide and conquer algorithms like homotopy. It's set up. If there is a solution, we're quite likely to find it in Dynair, assuming we have some idea what we're doing. If we have no idea what we're doing, that all bets are off. Okay. Okay. So that's the model of credibility. You just have to change it. Now, what I would do in terms of a strategy, Anahit, is that you just take the code here, you make a version of the program, okay, that basically just says, let's forget about the high state and let's look at the low state and then study the properties of the economy based on that. Okay. And then after you've got that figured out, now you could ask, let's suppose we want to have two. Okay. So, and what I do is I keep them separate. So I just say, this is a measure of credibility. Okay. That is appropriate for the high regime, or where people are worried about the high regime. And this is one that's appropriate in terms of the low inflation. So you basically just have to double the code and so on. Okay. Versus asking the silly question, what is credibility of just the low inflation regime against both regimes? And the reason is that it's going to introduce this credibility is going to introduce some bias in inflation expectations. That's what's going to make the results really interesting. So you can see that there's this term here, this kappa thing, and the 1 minus credibility. And so if something shifts credibility down, that's going to ratchet inflation expectations up. And so you're going to need to have exactly the same thing. If there's something that reduces credibility in the downward direction, it has to ratchet inflation expectations down. Okay. Yes, Lakasi.
Regarding this credibility, should we incorporate non-linearity, meaning that the higher the inflation is, the faster you lose credibility or not?
So that's something. So that's an example. We're talking about the US and stuff, right? But that's something that you could definitely that you could definitely think about for your countries and stuff, right? But that's another very interesting nonlinearity that it could depend on the level of the inflation rate. Okay, that the idea being that Ellen Greenspan said it this way: you want the way he said it was you want to pick an inflation rate that's low enough that people don't care anymore. Okay, and and uh, and I think that like every wise thing that a wise person says, you always got to think about uh, the wisdom in it, but you also have to think about the drawbacks in it. The problem is that if people don't care anymore, that can be good in the sense that things can be really, really anchored and stuff. But in certain situations where you need them to care, okay, they might respond too slowly. Okay, so I would just, as a general rule, thinking about policy issues, never think there's a free lunch. That there's always but yeah, we can investigate that, Cassie. That'd be super cool to investigate by basically saying that once you've got some inflation, then you've got incentives for people to care a lot more, okay, about being afraid of falling behind and so on. So I like that. I like that line of argument. Okay, now let's keep going here. These are just in the loss function to model the US because they're maximum employment guys. Okay, we just want to have negative output gaps entering the objective function. We don't want positive output gaps. So this is just a way to find a negative value using the absolute function. Okay, so you just take the series, subtract off the absolute value, divide by 2, and you get the negative value of a series. Okay. Then come sum is we want to calculate things like sacrifice ratios. So we just want to accumulate the output gap. And so this is just a simple way of doing that in model code. And then of course all the different types of equations. And as you can see, they're pretty compact. These are the expectation theory, the term structure. And so, instead of typing out really super long equations, we can, that's actually a big benefit because the code would get incredibly ugly and so on. So tons of financial variables, the expectation theory. What do we need to do? Well, back in April of this year, we need to, oh, by the way, I should say this, but why I'm teaching you guys this way. When I look back at my students, back when we had this way of doing it before we could do any estimation, that was my last batch of good students. And so once we gave them the Kalman filter and Iris, then of course things went bad because they thought that the computer was going to tell them what the answer was. In this modeling system, the economist, has to make up the values of all the state variables and so on. And so that means you have to decide things like what measure of inflation are you using, and you have to enter all those as initial conditions and so on. So this is that's also true of the output gap. Okay, so and we want the economist to actually truly make those numbers up, just like Don Cohn forced his economists at the Fed. He had figured this out a long time ago that you're just going to get terrible economists if they produce models, if they build models to produce answers, as opposed to getting the economists to actually know what is going on in the economy and to come up with estimates of what the output gap are. Now, of course, the output gap in this case will depend partly on the scenario. Like, is it a case A scenario or is it a case B scenario? Because your interpretation of inflation will depend on that. You also have to provide initial values of the real interest rate, any lags or whatever, as well as a bunch of variables, because we have the real exchange rate and blah, blah, blah. After you do that, then to produce a scenario, you have to come up with estimates of what you think the shocks are and so on. So I'm just gonna run this thing. Simul AB is basically just running the case A and the case B, just so you can I can give you an idea of where things stand. The only major difference in the two models right now is the fact that we're going to be using a loss function for the US. It's going to be very aggressive. If it thinks that it's in excess demand or excess supply, and if inflation's above or below, it will fight very hard. Whereas in the case of the euro area, they're going to be using an inflation forecast based reaction function and so on. So, but I'll just show you what the problem is, and then maybe you can help Anahit in the short run before you actually get something running on your computer. Like Assi, all this stuff can be done in Diner Julia, so you don't need to. You could let Anahit work in the MATLAB part, and you guys could continue working on whatever it is you have access to. I think I'd prefer actually use Diner Julia, but if you want to get Octave in MATLAB, that would work. That would work too. Okay. So we just have to wait it's going to take a while because it's MATLAB and it's slow. But it also has some terrible graphs. And that's what I want to explain to you. That's what needs to be done in the very short run. So what I'm looking for, Anahit, and you guys can help her, is like a package of charts where we'll be able to look at kind of on one page, and you have to think about, how is this going to look in the paper, and how's this going to look in a presentation, and so on. If you guys want to have standards about doing this sort of thing, I want you to look at a presentation by Martin Harding. Okay, again, another YouTube video. And I want you to look at the care and attention that Martin or somebody on that team had with graphs, as well as with labels and stuff like that. Okay, but if we thought of a summary page, okay, we would want to have obviously inflation in the US and the euro area. We'd want to have the policy rate, and we want to have the exchange rate. So that's brought in an asymmetric kind of a chart, because we have interest rates, inflation, and now we've got this darn exchange rate. One way to do that would be to report the exchange rate both ways, just to draw attention, or possibly what you could do is have the nominal exchange rate and the real exchange rate in the same chart, and so on. So we need to think about how we'd create a summary pack of charts that would allow us to tell the story, focusing in on a country. So the question is, what would be the summary charts for a for a single country. So you'd have one for the US and one for the Euro area. And then, of course, we need to have a chart pack that basically has absolutely everything in it. Okay, like a detailed country chart pack. Okay, so that's what we're looking for, is to think of some summary charts that would describe the basic ideas for both the US and Euro area in one packet and so on. And then, of course, one that focuses a summary on a country, and then, of course, a detailed chart pack where we can basically see everything that's going on, like including all the assumptions that we're making. So is it clear? So about is it clear what we're trying to do here?
Yes.
Okay.
So we need to plot impulse responses, right?
Well, they're not exactly impulse response functions because it's like a nonlinear model. Okay, so it's like scenarios. Okay, so I wouldn't describe them as impulse response functions because it's nonlinear and they're very so they are kind of like impulse response functions, but but they're more about scenarios where they started in a particular place. And of course, there's some assumptions about shocks, and then so you get the combination of initial conditions, the effects of initial conditions, and then of course some assumptions about shocks and stuff. But to actually understand, the model that the economy, you should be doing lots of experiments where you play around with different shocks to see how well does it work in different environments and so on. So the first thing is if you just go back and read the papers, the Reserve Bank of India's paper, they have two models, quarterly projection models. So we've got one with endocred and one that's a linearized monster, like you normally used to see and stuff, that where we're doing Kalman filter estimation and stuff. This is meant to be big boys, where we don't mess around with that Kalman filter estimation, but basically just start constructing scenarios and trying to understand how the model works. Now, if you go back to the Reserve Bank of India working paper, as well as all the working papers in this area, sorry, I can basically, we've dedicated a website to Mervyn King that has asked for this. And so if you go to research and you go down to, see, I thought she put it here. I thought there was something under research that was under Smart 2 Central Bank Research.
But maybe
what happened?
we need to click on FPAS Mark
What?
2 research. Maybe we need to click on FPAS Mark 2 research.
No, find it, because it was on there. Asya put on a whole page to Mervyn King, and it has all of our research in this area. And find it, Anahid, please. Don't understand why it wouldn't be under research. Anyway, you'll have to get it on there, Anahid, okay? So we'll adjourn now, but you'll have to get it on there. Okay. And then we should start the drafting from that. Okay. So Anna, you build, it doesn't make any sense to build with 4 people, but maybe what you do is you build with Tina. Okay. So you work in your room, on the model, trying to understand it. You document everything. In other words, you try an experiment. This is how you do this. Okay. You ask yourself, what is an interesting question? And then you say, now what am I going to do? What am I expecting to get? Okay. That is how you learn fundamentally things. Okay. And Lucasi and Sophie can basically just start reading and summarizing all that stuff on these models. And then, of course, they can start drafting it directly. I want to get something out as quickly as possible. Okay. To show what we can, what you guys can do. Okay. So they should start reading that stuff. See if they can read it in the next hour. Okay. So it's 9:04 now. Tina and Anahi will try to incorporate this model change in the next 40 minutes. Okay, changing it from the low thing to the high regime that you're worried about to the low inflation trap. And Lacassie and Sophie will read all those papers in the next 40 minutes and basically try to summarize what they learned. Okay, and then we'll meet back up.
Anna will share this paper, I guess, when we start reading.
Yeah. Yeah, just start off with the Reserve Bank of India. You start with that one
Okay,
first.
sure.
Okay. You both guys start independently, please, not together. I want independent reading and so on. Okay, you understand?
Sure.
Okay, good. See you. See you in an hour.
To summarize, just to summarize, because I came a bit late. The thing that Anahit and I have to do with the code is that the code is for high inflation, assessing for high inflation state, and we should change it to low inflation, and we should change coefficients, right, in the models with.
And then you should study the model as quickly as you can to understand what you get out of the model, and so it shock credibility. Okay, so so obviously in this world, if you shock credibility down, okay, inflation expectations ratchet up, term premiums should rise. It should be contractionary for the economy. The central bank has to fight like crazy. Okay, so then the question is, what are the major insights relative to a linear model? Okay, in other words, where credibility is presumed. Okay, and of course the linear model is going to be nuts. So you just have to show that the linear model is completely nuts, that presumes credibility, and that with imperfect credibility, that the model is much more sensible. Okay, or you have to make the model much more sensible. Okay, understand?
Yeah, can we also have a reading about the model as well, so that we are more informed?
Of course, that is, that's of course, but that's up to that's up to you over the next hour. If you want to do that at the same time, then that's fine. But you're on a 1 hour time constraint. Know what do what you know now, and the other guys can read because they don't have a computer. Okay, and we'll touch base in an hour. They'll explain to you what they know, and we'll share information at that point.
Oh, sorry, one thing. I sent the link for Marvin King page in the chat.
Can you show it to us, please?
Can you see it?
Yeah. Okay, so go down. Yeah, so you should know all these papers. Okay. You know what you can do, Lacassie, is you can use Gemini. Okay, this would be really cool.
Using it.
Yeah, well, you should use Gemini and do it systematic. Okay, in the sense that you bring all these papers into Gemini, and then we can start using them. Okay, that would be really good in the next 40 minutes. Okay, like then you
Doug, let me clarify about
create a
this Reserve
summary
Bank of
and stuff like that.
You understand my words?
Yeah, speak.
About this Reserve Bank of India. So we have to read quarterly projection model for India published by IMF, right?
Yeah, but you want to read all these things.
Sure. Nice,
All
nice,
these things
nice,
you want to
gotcha.
read. Okay.
Sure.
Okay. I'd start there because you can tell the difference between a quarterly projection model linear versus one with endogenous credibility. And of course, you'll see the nonsense in your linear model. It'll be like free lunches. In other words, if you delay raising interest rates, you'll actually get output because the system is presumed to be anchored and so on, right? That's what the
Sure.
problem. That's Mervyn King's problem. Okay, which is he's right. He's absolutely right about that. But the question is, did he just figure that out now? That's really what's wrong about it. You know, he was governor for many years. Did people at the Bank of England have no idea about that? As governor, why would he complain about that now? He should have been complaining about that 30 years ago and working with us uh, on these issues. Okay. So why is it? Why is it that people are doing that? Like why? And the answer is because when they go to grad school, they're kind of taught this econometric methodology nonsense, and of course, unless they can estimate it, they can't think about it, and that's fundamentally what the problem is here. Okay, that they want to be little bean counters and be able to estimate something. Say the model says, that this is what the answer is. That's fundamentally what the problem is here. Okay.